Okay, let's see how it's going to work. Mm, pretty good. Hello, hello, welcome to my stream. Вот ты меня спрашиваешь, зачем стримить, а я такой, камон, мой самый главный фанат. Так, книжку буду читать на английском. Можешь засыпать, просто ложиться под нее. Вот, сейчас я устроюсь поудобнее здесь. Тут чай, все есть, все классно. Хорошо, что качество хорошее тоже. Так, окей, поехали. Так, вот это нас интересует. Listo, vamos. So today I'm going to read the Tibetan Book of the Dead, Tim Leary, Ralph Metzner adaptation. And it's a very interesting read. I find this book coming back into my life over and over again, and I guess the general public can really benefit from this information. So without further ado, let me start with the introduction. The authors were engaged in a program of experiments with LSD and other psychedelic drugs at Harvard University until sensational national publicity, unfairly concentrating on student interest in the drugs, led to the suspension of the experiments. Since then, the authors have continued their work without academic auspices. This version of the Tibetan Book of the Dead is dedicated to Aldous Huxley, July 26, 1894, November 22, 1963, with profound admiration and gratitude. If you started in the wrong way, I said in answer to the investigators' questions, everything that happened would be a proof of the conspiracy against you. It would be all self-validating. You couldn't draw a breath without knowing it was part of the plot. So you think you know where madness lies? My answer was a convinced and heartfelt yes. And you couldn't control it. No, I couldn't control it. If one began with fear and hate as the major premise, one would have to go on the conclusion. Would you be able, my wife asked, to fix your attention on what the Tibetan Book of the Dead calls the clear light? I was doubtful. Would it keep the evil away if you could hold it, or would you not be able to hold it? I considered the question for some time. Perhaps, I answered at last. Perhaps I could, but only if there were somebody there to tell me about the clear light. One couldn't do it by oneself. That's the point, I suppose, of the Tibetan ritual. Somebody sitting there all the time and telling you what is what. This is an excerpt from a book of Aldous Huxley, Doors of Perception, pages 57 to 58, that is related to his psychedelic experience. And I just want to add from myself that it's so difficult to describe this kind of experiences that people who really try, they become great writers, like Aldous Huxley, for example. And The Doors of Perception is also very, very interesting read that I would like to recommend anybody present on this stream. Okay, let us proceed with general introduction. Have my tea ready, my setup working, everything is good. So get comfortable and get ready to listen to this wonderful book. Okay, a psychedelic experience is a journey to new realms of consciousness. The scope and content of the experience is limitless, but its characteristic features are the transcendence of verbal concepts, of space-time dimensions, and of the ego or identity, also of the body. This is something from me. Such experiences of enlarged consciousness can occur in a variety of ways: sensory deprivation, yoga exercises, disciplined meditation, religious or aesthetic ecstasies, or spontaneously. Most recently, they have become available to anyone through the ingestion of psychedelic drugs such as LSD, psilocybin, mescaline, DMT, etc. This is the statement of an ideal, not an actual situation in 1964. The psychedelic drugs are in the United States classified as experimental drugs. That is, they are not available on a prescription basis, but only to qualified investigators. The Federal Food and Drug Administration has defined qualified investigators to mean psychiatrists working in a mental hospital setting, whose research is sponsored by either state or federal agencies. Of course, the drug dose does not produce the transcendent experience. It merely acts as a chemical key. It opens the mind, frees the nervous system of its ordinary patterns and structures. The nature of the experience depends almost entirely on set and setting. Set denotes the preparation of the individual, including his personality structure and his mood at the time. Setting is physical: the weather, the room's atmosphere; social, feelings of persons present towards one another; and cultural, prevailing views as to what is real. It is for this reason the manuals of guidebooks are necessary. Their purpose is to enable a person to understand the new realities of the expanded consciousness, to serve as the roadmaps for new interior territories which modern science has made accessible. Different explorers draw different maps. Other manuals are to be written based on different models: scientific, aesthetic, therapeutic. The Tibetan model on which this manual is based is designed to teach the person to direct and control awareness in such a way as to reach that level of understanding variously called liberation, illumination or enlightenment. In the manual is read several times If the manual is read several times before a session is attempted, and if a trusted person is there to remind and refresh the memory of the voyager during the experience, the consciousness will be freed from the games which comprise personality and from positive negative hallucinations which often accompany states of expanded awareness. The Tibetan Book of the Dead was called in its own language the Bardo Todol, which means liberation by hearing on the after-death plane. The book stresses over and over that the free consciousness has only to hear and remember the teachings in order to be liberated. Again, I'm going to repeat this beautiful piece again. The book stresses over and over that the free consciousness has only to hear and remember the teachings in order to be liberated. So to continue, the Tibetan Book of the Dead is ostensibly a book describing the experiences to be expected at the moment of death, during an intermediate phase lasting 49 7 times 7 days, and during rebirth into another bodily frame. This, however, is merely the exoteric framework which the Tibetan Buddhists use to cloak their mystical teachings. The language and symbolism of death rituals of Bonism, the traditional pre-Buddhist Tibetan religion, were skillfully blended with Buddhist conceptions. The esoteric meaning, as it has been interpreted in this manual, is that it is death and rebirth that is described, not of the body. Lama Govinda indicates this clearly in his introduction when he writes, "It is a book for the living as well as the dying." The book's esoteric meaning is often concealed beneath many layers of symbolism. It was not intended for general reading. It was designed to be understood only by one who was to be initiated personally by a guru into the Buddhist mystical doctrines, into the pre-mortem death rebirth experience. These doctrines have been kept a closely guarded secret for many centuries, for fear that naive or careless application would do harm. In translating such an esoteric text, therefore, there are two steps. One is rendering of the original text into English, and two, the practical interpretation of the text for its uses. In publishing this practical interpretation for use in the psychedelic drug session, we are in a sense breaking with the tradition of secrecy and thus contravening the teachings of the Lama gurus. However, this step is justified on the grounds that the manual will not be understood by anyone who has not had a consciousness expanding experience, and that there are signs that the Lamas themselves, after their recent diaspora, wish to make their teachings available to a wider public. Following the Tibetan model, then, we distinguish three phases of the psychedelic experience. The first period, Chikai Bardo, is that of complete transcendence, beyond words, beyond space-time, beyond self. There are no visions, no sense of self, no thoughts. There are only pure awareness and ecstatic freedom from all game and biological involvements. Games, quote unquote, are behavioral sequences defined by roles, rules, rituals, goals, strategies, values, language, characteristics, space-time locations, and characteristics patterns of movement. Sorry, any behavior not having these 9 features is non-game. That includes physiological reflexes, spontaneous play, and transcendent awareness. The second lengthy period involves self or external game reality, Chonit Bardo, in sharp, exquisite clarity or in the form of hallucinations, karmic apparitions. The final period, Sitpa Bardo, involves the return to routine game reality and the self. For most persons, the second, aesthetic or hallucinatory stage is the longest. For the initiated, the first stage of illumination lasts longer. For the unprepared, the heavy game players, those who anxiously cling to their egos, and for those who take the drugs in a non-supportive setting, the struggle to regain reality begins early and usually lasts to the end of their session. Words like this are static, whereas the psychedelic experience is fluid and ever-changing. Typically, the subject's consciousness flicks in and out of these 3 levels with rapid oscillations. One purpose of this manual is to enable the person to regain the transcendence of the first bardo and to avoid prolonged entrapments in hallucinatory or ego-dominated game patterns. The basic trusts and beliefs. You must be ready to accept the possibility that there is a limitless range of awareness for which we now have no words, that awareness can expand beyond range of your ego, yourself, your familiar and identity, beyond everything you have ever learned, beyond your notions of space and time, beyond the differences which usually separate people from each other and from the world around them. You must remember that throughout human history millions have made this voyage. A few, whom we call mystics, saints, or Buddhas, have made this experience endure and have communicated it to their fellow men. You must remember too that the experience is safe. At the very worst, you will end up the same person who entered the experience. Again, I want to repeat this beautiful piece. You must remember, too, that the experience is safe. At the very worst, you will end up the same person who entered the experience, and that all of the dangers which you have feared are unnecessary productions of your own mind. Whether you experience heaven or hell, remember that it is your mind which creates them. Avoid grasping the one or fleeing the other. Avoid imposing the ego game on the experience. You must try to maintain faith and trust in the potentiality of your own brain and the billion-year-old life process. With your ego left behind you, your brain cannot go wrong. Try to keep the memory of a trusted friend or a respected person whose name can serve as a guide and protection. Trust your divinity, trust your brain, trust your companions. Whenever in doubt, turn off your mind, relax, float downstream. After reading this guide, the prepared person should be able at the very beginning of his experience to move directly to a state of non-game ecstasy and deep revelation. But if you are not well prepared, or if there is game distraction around you, you will find yourself dropping back. If this happens, then the instructions in part 4 should help you regain and maintain liberation. Liberation in this context does not necessarily imply, especially in the case of the average person, the liberation of nirvana, but chiefly a liberation of the life flux from the ego in such a manner as will afford the greatest possible consciousness and consequent happy rebirth. Yet, for the very experienced and very highly efficient person, the same esoteric process of transference. Readers interested in a more detailed discussion of the process of transference are referred to Tibetan Yoga and Sacred Doctrines, edited by Ivan Svens, Oxford University Press. Can be, according to the Lama Gurus, so employed as to prevent any break in the flow of the stream of consciousness from the moment of the ego loss to the moment of a conscious rebirth 8 hours later. I'm going to make a little remark here. 8 hours later, they're talking about LSD here, specifically 8 hours. If we talk in psilocybin, it's 4 to 5 hours, depending on the method of consumption. So let's continue. Judging from the translation made by the late Lama Kazi Dawa Samdap of an old Tibetan manuscript containing practical directions for ego-low states, the ability to maintain a non-game ecstasy throughout the entire experience is possessed only by persons trained in mental concentration, or one-pointedness of mind. A little remark from me, mental concentration and the one-pointedness of mind they talking here is a very simple technique, the basic Buddhist meditations like breath meditation, when you concentrate your attention on your breath, or walking meditation when you concentrate your attention on the soles of your feet making the steps. Um, so, so again, the ability to maintain a non-game ecstasy throughout the entire psychedelic experience is possessed only by persons trained in mental concentration to such a high degree of proficiency as to be able to control all the mental functions and to shut out the distractions of the outside world. This manual is divided into four parts. I lost my cursor, sorry. Okay, this manual is divided into four parts. The first part is introductory. The second is a step-by-step description of a psychedelic experience based directly on the Tibetan Book of the Dead. The third part contains practical suggestions on how to prepare for and conduct a psychedelic session. The fourth part contains instructive passages adapted from the Bardo Todol which may be read to the voyager during his session, to facilitate the movement of consciousness. In the remainder of this introductory section, we review three commentaries of the Tibetan Book of the Dead, published by the Evans Vance edition. There are the introduction by Evans Vance himself, the distinguished translator, editor of four treatises on Tibetan mysticism, the commentary by Carl Jung, the Swiss psychoanalysts, and by Lama Govinda, and initiate of one of the principal Buddhist orders of Tibet. A tribute to Evans Vance. Dr. Evans Vance, who literally sat at the feet of a Tibetan Lama for years in order to acquire his wisdom, not only displays a deeply sympathetic interest in those esoteric doctrines so characteristic of the genius of the East, but likewise possesses the rare faculty of making them more or less intelligible to the layman. Evans Vance is a great scholar who devoted his mature years to the role of bridge and shuttle between Tibet and the West, like an RNA molecule activating the latter with the coded message of the former. No greater tribute could be paid to the work of this academic liberator than to base our psychedelic manual upon his insights and to quote directly his comments on the message of this book. The message is that the art of dying is quite as important as the art of living, or of coming into birth, of which it is the complement and summation, that the future of being is independent, perhaps entirely, upon a rightly controlled death. Again, the future of being is dependent, perhaps entirely, upon a rightly controlled death, as the second part of this volume, setting forth the art of reincarnating, emphasizes. The art of dying, as indicated by the death rite associated with initiation into the mysteries of antiquity, and referred to by oh Jesus Christ, I can't pronounce his name, referred to by an Platonic philosopher, himself an initiate, and by many other illustrious initiates, and as the Egyptian Book of the Dead suggests, appears to have been far better known to the ancient peoples inhabiting the Mediterranean countries than it is now by their descendants in Europe and the Americas. To those who had passed through the secret experiencing of pre-mortem death, right dying is initiation. conferring, as does the initiatory death rite, the power to control consciously the process of death and regeneration. The Oxford scholar, like his great predecessor of the 11th century Marpa, the translator, who rendered Indian Buddhist texts into Tibetan, thereby preserving them from extinction, saw the vital importance of these doctrines and made them accessible to many. The secret is no longer hidden. The art of dying is quite as important as the art of living. I love this so much. The art of dying is quite as important as the art of living. A tribute to Carl G. Jung. Psychology is the systematic attempt to describe and explain man's behavior, both conscious and non-conscious. The scope of study is broad, covering the infinite variety of human activity and experience, and it is long, tracing back through the history of the individual, through the history of his ancestors, back through the evolutionary vicissitudes and triumphs which have determined the current status of the species. Most difficult of all, the scope of psychology is complex, dealing as it does with processes which are ever changing. Little wonder that psychologists, in the face of such complexity, escaped into specialization and parochial narrowness. This language is quite old. I find words that I don't know really from this book. I'm sorry if I don't pronounce them quite right. A psychology is based on the available data and the psychologist's ability and willingness to utilize them. The behaviorism and experimentalism of 20th century Western psychology is so narrow as to be mostly trivial. Consciousness is eliminated from the field of inquiry. Social application and social meaning are largely neglected. A curious ritualism is enacted by a priesthood rapidly growing in power and numbers. Eastern psychology, by contrast, offers us a long history of detailed observation and systemization of the range of human consciousness, along with an enormous literature of practical methods for controlling and changing consciousness. Western intellectuals tend to dismiss Oriental psychology. The theories of consciousness are seen as occult and mystical. The methods of investigating consciousness change, such as meditation, yoga, monastic retreat, and sensory deprivation, and are seen as alien to scientific investigation. And most damning of all in the eyes of the European scholar is the alleged disregard of Eastern psychologies for the practical, behavior and social aspects of life. Such criticism betrays limited concepts and the inability to deal with the available historical data on a meaningful level. The psychologies of the East have always found practical application in the running of the state, in the running of daily life and family. A wealth of guides and handbooks exists. The Book of Tao, the Analects of Confucius, the Gita, the I Ching, the Tibetan Book of the Dead, to mention only the best known. Eastern psychology can be judged in terms of the use of available evidence. The scholars and observers of China, Tibet, and India went as far as their data allowed them. They lacked the findings of modern science, and so their metaphors seem vague and poetic. Yet this does not negate their value. Indeed, Eastern philosophic theories dating back 4,000 years adapt readily to the most recent discoveries of nuclear physics, biochemistry, genetics, and astronomy. A major task of any present-day psychology, Eastern or Western, is to construct a frame of reference large enough to incorporate the recent findings of the energy sciences into a revised picture of a man, judged against the criteria of the use of available fact. The greatest psychologists of the century are William James and Carl Jung. To properly compare Jung with Sigmund Freud, we must look at the available data which each man appropriated for his explorations. For Freud, it was Darwin, classical thermodynamics, the Old Testament, Renaissance cultural history, and most important, the closed overheated atmosphere of the Jewish family. The broader scope of Jung reference materials assumes that his theories will find a greater congeniality with recent developments in the energy sciences and the evolutionary sciences. Both of these men avoided the narrow paths of behaviorism and experimentalism. Both of them fought to preserve experience and consciousness as an area of scientific research. Both kept open to the advance of scientific theory, and both refused to shut off Eastern scholarship from consideration. Jung used for his source of data that most fertile source, the internal. He recognized the rich meaning of the Eastern message. He reacted to that great Rorschach inkblot, the Tao Te Ching. He wrote perspective, brilliant forewords to the I Ching, to the secret of the golden flower, and struggled with the meaning of Tibetan Book of the Dead. For years, ever since it was first published, the Bardo Todol has been my constant companion, and to it I owe not only many stimulating ideas and discoveries, but also many fundamental insights. Its philosophy contains the quintessence of Buddhist psychological criticism, and as such one can truly say it is of an unexampled superiority. The Bardo Total is the highest degree psychological in its outlook, but with us philosophy and theology are still in the medieval, pre-psychological stage, where only the assertions are listened to, explained, defended, criticized, and disputed, while the authority that makes them has by general consent been deposed as outside the scope of discussion. Metaphysical assertions, however, are statements of the psyche, and are therefore psychological. To the Western mind, which compensates its well-known feelings of resentment by a slavish regard for rational explanations, the obvious truth seems all too obvious, or else it is seen as an inadmissible negation of metaphysical truths. Whenever the Westerner hears the word psychological, it always sounds to him like only psychological. Jung draws, Jung draws upon Oriental conceptions of consciousness to broaden the concept of projection. Not only the wrathful, but also the peaceful deities are conceived as sensoric projections of the human psyche, an idea that seems all too obvious to the enlightened European because it reminds him of his own banal, banality, I guess banal simplifications. But through the European, but though the European can easily explain away these deities as projections, he would be quite incapable of positing them at the same time as real. The Bardo Total can do that because, in certain of its most essential metaphysical premises, it has the enlightened as well as the unenlightened European at a disadvantage. The ever-present, unspoken assumption of the Bardo Total is the antinomial character of all metaphysical assertions, and also the idea of the qualitative difference of the various levels of consciousness and of the metaphysical realities conditioned by them. The background of this unusual book is not the niggardly European either-or, but a magnificently affirmative both-and. That statement may appear objectionable to the Western philosopher, for the West loves clarity and unambiguity. Consequent- Consequently, one philosopher clings to the position God is, while another clings equally fervently to the negation God is not. Jung clearly sees the power and breadth in the Tibetan model, but occasionally he fails to grasp its meaning and application. Jung too was limited, as we all are, to the social models of his tribe. He was a psychoanalyst, the father of a school. Psychotherapy and psychiatric diagnosis were the two applications which came most naturally to him. Yun misses the central concept of the Tibetan book. This is not, as Lama Govinda reminds us, a book of the dead. It is a book of the dying, which is to say, a book of the living. It is a book of life and how to live. The concept of actual physical death was an esoteric facade adopted to fit the prejudices of the Buddhist tradition in Tibet. Far from being an embalmer's guide, the manual is a detailed account of how to lose the ego, how to break out of personality into new realms of consciousness, and how to avoid the involuntary limiting processes of the ego, how to make the consciousness expansion experience endure in subsequent daily life. Oof, yeah, this is something. Oh, this is something I love very much. Jung struggles with this point. He comes close but never quite clenches it. He had nothing in his conceptual framework which could make practical sense out of the ego loss experience. The Tibetan Book of the Dead of the Bardo Todol is a book of instructions for the dead and dying. Like the Egyptian Book of the Dead, it is meant to be a guide for the dead man during the period of his bardo existence. In this quote, Jung settles for the exoteric and misses the esoteric. In a later quote, he seems to come closer. The instruction given in the Bardo Total serves to recall to the dead man the experience of his initiation and the teachings of his guru. For the instruction is, at bottom, nothing less than an initiation of the dead into the Bardo life, just as the initiation of the living was a preparation for the beyond. Such was the case, at least, with all the mystery cults in ancient civilizations from the time of the Egyptian and Eleusinian mysteries. In the initiation of the living, however, this beyond is not a world beyond death, but a reversal of the mind's intentions and outlook, a psychological beyond, or, in Christian terms, a redemption from the trammels of the world of sin. Redemption is a separation and deliverance from an earlier condition of darkness and unconsciousness, and leads a condition of illumination and releasedness to victory and transcendence over everything given. Thus far, the Bardo Total is, as Dr. Evans Vance also feels, an initiation process, whose purpose is to restore to the soul the divinity it lost at birth. In still another passage, Jung continues the struggle but misses again. Nor is the psychological use we make of it, he means the book, anything but a secondary intention, though one that is possibly sanctioned by Lamaist custom. The real purpose of this singular book is the attempt, which must seem very strange to the educated European of the 20th century, to enlighten the dead on their journey through the regions of the Bardo. The Catholic Church is the only place in the world of the white man where any provision is made for the souls of the departed. In the summary of Lama Govinda comments which follow we shall see that the Tibetan commentator, freed from the European concepts of Yun, moves directly to the esoteric and practical meaning of the Tibetan book. In his autobiography, written in 1960, Yun commits himself wholly to the inner vision and to the wisdom of superior reality of internal perceptions. In 1938, when his Tibetan commentary was written, he was moving in this direction but cautiously and with the ambivalent reservations of the psychiatrist. Mystic. Okay, a little break. Just a little bit of fuel. Okay, let's go. The dead man must desperately resist the dictates of reason, as we understand it, and give up the supremacy of egohood regarded by reason as sacrosanct. What this means in practice is complete capitulation to the objective powers of the psyche, with all that entails, a kind of symbological death corresponding to the judgment of death in the Sitpa Bardo. It means the end of all conscious, rational, morally responsible conduct of life, and a voluntary surrender to what the Bardo Total calls karmic illusion. Karmic illusion springs from belief in the visionary world of an extremely irrational nature, which neither accords with nor derives from our rational judgments, but is the exclusive product of uninhibited imagination. It is sheer dream or fantasy, and every well-meaning person will instantly caution us against it. Nor indeed can one see at first sight what is the difference between fantasies of this kind and the phantasmagoria of a lunatic. Very often, only a slight abasement du niveau mental is needed to unleash this world of illusion. The terror and darkness of this moment has its equivalent in the experiences described in the opening sections of the Sita Bardo. But the contents of this bardo also reveal the archetypes, the karmic images which appear first in the terrifying form. The chonid state is equivalent to a deliberately induced psychosis. The transition, then, from the sitpa state to the chonid state is a dangerous reversal of the aims and intentions of the conscious mind. It is a sacrifice of the ego stability and a surrender to extreme uncertainty of what must seem like chaotic riot or of phantasmal forms. When Freud coined the phrase that the ego was the true seed of anxiety, he was giving voice to a very true and profound intuition. Fear of self-sacrifice lurks deep in every ego, and this fear is often only the precariously controlled demand for the unconscious forces to burst out in full force. No one who strives for selfhood, individuation, is spared this dangerous passage, For that which is feared also belongs to the wholeness of the self, the subhuman or suprahuman world of psychic dominance from which the ego originally emancipated itself with enormous effort, and then only partially for the sake of a more or less illusory freedom. This liberation is certainly a very necessary and very heroic undertaking, but it represents nothing final. It is merely the creation of a subject who, in order to find fulfillment, has still to be confronted by an object. This, at first sight, would appear to be the world, which is swelled out with projections for that very purpose. Here we seek and find our difficulties. Here we seek and find our enemy. Here we seek and find what is dear and precious to us. And it is comforting to know that all evil and all good is to be found out here in the visible object where it can be conquered, punished, destroyed, or enjoyed. But nature herself does not allow this paradisal state of innocence to continue forever. There are, and always have been, those who cannot help but see that the world and its experiences are in the nature of a symbol, and that it really reflects something that lies hidden in the subject himself, in his own trans-subjective reality. In its It is from this profound intuition, according to Lama's doctrine, that the chonit state derives its true meaning, which is the why the chonit bardo is entitled the bardo of the experiencing of reality. The reality experienced in the chonit state is, as the last section of the corresponding bardo teaches, the reality of thought. The thought forms appear as realities. Fantasy takes on real form, and the terrifying dream evoked by karma are played and played out by the unconscious dominant begins. Jung would not have been surprised by professional and institutional antagonism to psychedelics. He closes his Tibetan commentary with a poignant political aside. The Bardo Total began by being a closed book, and so it had remained, no matter what kind of commentaries may be written upon it. For it is a book only that will only open itself to spiritual understanding, and this is a capacity which no man is born with, but which he can only acquire through special training and special experience. It is good that such, to all intents and purposes, useless books exist. They are meant for those queer folk who no longer set much store by the uses, aims, and meaning of present-day civilization, to provide special training and for the special experience provided by psychedelic materials is the purpose of this version of the Tibetan Book of the Dead. Whew. Yeah, need more tea. I have no idea how many people are present on this stream, but I just want to point out that this information that I'm giving here today is very special kind of information that is directly related to the true nature of your human experience. And I was highly skeptical in my life for the entirety of my life, for like what? More than 30 years. Yeah, more than 30 years. Even after I started to work with psychedelics, you know, materialistic views, my reductionist approach was so strong that it bloated out the immediate experience that I had. But eventually, after some events, eventually after some events that happened in my life, I found this book to be very, very useful for anybody who is in a state of search. So if you're searching for your true self, or for example, you know where you want to go, know who you want to be, and you just cannot devise the means to do that, this info is for you. This info is very helpful on the way to personal transformation. And now that we have these wonderful tools, which are psychedelics, it's just shame not to use them. We have everything. Everything is laid out in front of our very eyes. It is just for us to reach out and take it. Take the knowledge, take the technologies, use them. It's so good that I can share it with you. And I can vouch personally for the information that is given in this book, that it's working. It's very, very powerful approach to psychedelic transformation and consequent, and like to the personal transformation too. Now I'm just really exercising my English muscle here a little bit. After I moved back to Russia, I've been here for what now? October, November. More than I would like to. 2 months, yeah, 2 months, and there is enough communication with my clients, of course. Uh, but this book is so well written. I enjoy it so much. I decided to share this, to give it a life with my voice again, again and again and again. Comes back to my life, and now I'm introducing the same piece of great literature into your life. It feels damn good. I think I made some mistakes reading the book because it's so complex. My vocabulary struggles, but yeah, it's okay. It's only human. I'm just talking to myself at this point. So anyway, I'm going to finish with the tributes today, definitely. A tribute to Lama Anagarika Govinda. In the preceding section, the point was made that Eastern philosophy and psychology, poetic, indeterministic, experiential, inward-looking, vaguely evolutionary, open-ended, is more easily adapted to the findings of modern science than the syllogistic, certain experimental, externalizing logic of Western psychology. The latter imitates the irrelevant rituals of the energy sciences but ignores the data of physics and genetics, the meanings and implications. Even Carl Jung, the most penetrating of the Western psychologists, failed to understand the basic philosophy of the Bardo Todol, Quite in contrast are the comments on the Tibetan manual by Lama Govinda. His opening statement, at first glance, would cause a Judaico-Christian psychologist to snort in impatience, but a close look at these phrases reveal that they are only poetic statement of the genetic situation as currently described by biochemists and DNA researchers. It may be argued that nobody can talk about death with authority who has not died, and since nobody apparently has ever returned from death, how can anybody know what death is or what happens after it? The Tibetan will answer, there is not one person, indeed not one living being, that has not returned from death. In fact, we have died many deaths before we came into this incarnation, and what we call birth is merely the reverse side of death, like one of the two sides of the coin, or like a door, which we call entrance from outside and exit from inside the room. The Lama then goes on to make a second poetic comment about the potentialities of the nervous system, the complexity of the human cortical computer. It is much more astonishing that not everybody remembers his or her previous deaths. Because of this lack of remembering, most persons do not believe there was a previous death, but likewise they do not remember their recent births, and yet they do not doubt that they were recently born. They forget that active memory is only a small part of our normal consciousness, and that our subconscious memory registers and preserves every past impression and experience which our waking mind fails to recall. The Lama then proceeds to slice directly to the esoteric meaning of the bardo to doll, that core meaning which Yun and indeed most European Orientalists have failed to grasp. For this reason, the bardo to doll, the Tibetan book, vouchsafing liberation from the intermediate state between life and rebirth, which state man can call death, has been couched in symbolic language. It is a book which is sealed with the seven seals of silence, not because its knowledge would be misunderstood and therefore would tend to mislead and harm those who are unfitted to receive it. But the time has come to break the seals of silence, for the human race has come to the juncture where it must decide whether to be content with the subjugation of the material world or to strive after the conquest of the spiritual world by subjugating selfish desires and transcending self-imposed limitations. Jesus Christ, this is so good. Oof. It's been some time since I read it last time. And yeah, hope you're enjoying this as much as I do. The Lama next describes the effects of consciousness expansion techniques. He is talking here about the method he knows, the yogic, but his words are equally applicable to the psychedelic experience. There are those who, in virtue of concentration and other yogic practices, are able to bring the subconscious into the realm of discriminative consciousness and thereby to draw upon the unrestricted treasury of subconscious memory, wherein are stored the records not only of our past lives, but the records of the past of our race, the past of humanity, and of all pre-human forms of life, if not of the very consciousness that makes life possible in this universe. If, through some trick of nature, the gates of an individual subconsciousness were suddenly to spring open, the unprepared mind would be overwhelmed and crushed. Therefore, the gates of the subconscious are guarded by all initiates and hidden behind the veil of mysteries and symbols. In a later section of his foreword, the Lama presents a more detailed elaboration of the inner meaning of the Tudol. If the Bardo Tudol were to be regarded as being based merely upon folklore, or as consisting of religious speculation about death and a hypothetical after-death state, it would be of interest only to anthropologists and students of religion. But the Bardo Tudol is far more. It is a key to the innermost recesses of the human mind, and a guide for initiates and for those who are seeking the spiritual path of liberation. Although the Bardo Tudol is at present time widely used in Tibet as breviary, and read or recited on the occasion of death, for which reason it had been aptly called the Tibetan Book of the Dead, one should not forget that it was originally conceived to serve as a guide not only for the dying and the dead, but for the living as well. And herein lies the justification for having made the Tibetan Book of the Dead accessible to a wider public. Notwithstanding the popular customs and beliefs which, under the influence of age-old traditions of the pre-Buddhist origin, have grown around the profound revelations of the Bardo Todol, it has value only for those who practice and realize its teachings during their lifetime. There are two things which have caused misunderstanding. One is that the teachings seem to be addressed to the dead or dying. The other, that the title contains the expression liberation through hearing, in Tibetan tos grol, strange language. As a result, there has arisen the belief that it is sufficient to read or recite the Bardo Todol in the presence of a dying person, or even of a person who has just died, in order to effect his or her liberation. Sorry. Such misunderstanding could only have arisen among those who do not know that it is one of the oldest and most universal practices for the initiate to go through the experience of death before he can be spiritually reborn. Symbolically, he must die to his past and to his old ego before he can take his place in the new spiritual life into which he has been initiated. The dead or the dying person is addressed in the Bardo Todol mainly for three reasons. The earnest practitioner of these teachings should regard every moment of his or her life as it were the last. When a follower of these teachings is actually dying, he or she should be reminded of the experiences at the time of initiation, or of the words or mantra of the Guru, especially if the dying one's mind lacks alertness during the critical moments, and one who is still incarnate should try to surround the person dying or just dead with loving and helpful thoughts during the first stages of the new or after-death state of existence, without allowing emotional attachment to interfere or to give rise to a state of morbid mental depression. Accordingly, one function of the Bardo Total appears to be more to help those who have been left behind to adopt the right attitude towards the dead and towards the fact of death than to assist the dead, who, according to Buddhist belief, will not deviate from their own karmic path. That proves that we have to do here with life itself, and not merely with a mass for the dead, to which the Bardo Total was reduced in later times. Under the guise of a science of death, the Bardo Total reveals the secret of life, and therein lies its spiritual value and its universal appeal. Here, then, is the key to a mystery which has been passed down for over 2,500 years, the consciousness expansion experience. the pre-mortem death and rebirth rite. The Vedic sages knew the secret. The Eleusinian initiates knew it. The Tantrics knew it. In all their esoteric writings, they whisper the message. It is possible to cut beyond ego consciousness, to tune in on neurological processes which flash by at the speed of light, and to become aware of the enormous treasury of ancient racial knowledge welded into the nucleus of every cell in your body. Modern psychedelic chemicals provide a key to this forgotten realm of awareness. But just as this manual without the psychedelic awareness is nothing but an exercise in academic Tibetology, so too the potent chemical key is of a little value without the guidance and the teachings. Westerners do not accept the existence of conscious processes for which they have no operational term. The attitude which is prevalent is, if you can't label it and if it is beyond current notions of space-time and personality, then it is not open for investigation. Thus we see the ego loss experience confused with schizophrenia. Thus we see present-day psychiatrists solemnly pronouncing the psychedelic keys as a psychosis producing and dangerous. Which is no longer the case, thank God, right? The new visionary chemicals and the pre-mortem death rebirth experience may be pushed once again into the shadows of history. Looking back, we remember that every Middle Eastern and European administrator, with the exception of certain periods in Greece and Persia, has, during the last 3,000 years, rushed to pass laws against any emerging transcendental process, the pre-mortem death rebirth session, its adepts, and any new method of consciousness expansion. The present moment in human history, as Lama Govinda points out, is critical. Now, for the first time, we possess the means of providing the enlightenment to any prepared volunteer. The enlightenment always comes, we remember, in the form of new energy process, a physical neurological event. For these reasons, we have prepared this psychedelic version of the Tibetan Book of the Dead. The secret is released once again in a new dialect, and we sit back quietly to observe whether man is ready to move ahead and to make use of these new tools provided by modern science. Whew. So that's it with the first part of the Tibetan Book of the Dead, Bardo Total. Adaptation by Tim Leary, adaptation for the psychedelic experience. And I have no idea how many people saw this. But if you saw this, you're lucky. You are in luck. The part 2 is going to come 2, maybe 3 days from now, something like this. I'm going to read the whole book, most definitely, because I need to remind myself about the information present in it, and I need to remind you. So yeah, I guess I'm going to take a break for a couple of days. I have so many earthly affairs going on. And then get back here and read the second part. Thanks everybody who came here today, listened to the information. If it's curious for you, I'm very happy. Spreading the good stuff. And with that being said, I'm going to end the stream.